Great. Well, thank you very much. So I think the organisers thought, a little bit of a comedic break to bring in the amateur. And so thank you very much to them for doing that and for the opportunity for talking to you. So what I'm going to be talking about is the black box problem. Here is the black box problem. I'm sort of guessing that everyone has a sense of what the black box problem is, or at least the headline claim of the black box problem, which is that lots of the... It's the blue blocks problem. It's philosophy, so I don't know how important the slides are, really. It's not like I've got cool graphs that explain everything to you. So maybe I should just carry on. So we all know roughly what the headlines are of the black box problem. Okay? And the headline is that we have these machine learning systems, some of which we don't understand. So we build them, they seem to be reliable, they do the work we want them to do, but in one or another way, we say that they're not explainable or they're not interpretable. In one or another way, we say that they are opaque. Here's a quote from Demis Hassabis, who we all know from DeepMind, and he says, we roughly know, talking of his own deep learning, machine learning systems, he says, look, we roughly know what these systems do, but not specifically this bit of code is doing this and this bit of code is doing that. And he went on to say in this interview that when we're talking about highly critical, safety-critical systems, we might really feel the need to have answers to those questions. And of course, that presents the black box problem rather than just the black box phenomenon. The problem is supposed to be that we want to know what's going on inside these machines, and nonetheless, we don't. So you've missed the cool picture of Burns from The Simpsons holding his mystery box. Sad. I'm going to have to go to the next slide, but I sort of feel like that was probably the pinnacle of the talk. So that's the headline black box problem, right? We've got some machine learning systems, and we all know that we sort of grade machine learning systems. Some of them feel like they're more opaque than others, that they're sort of blacker, harder to look into than others. And I'm just going to focus on deep learning systems from my own non-technical point of view. That's the problem, that's the black box problem. But what I want to get you to think about today is what I think of as the real puzzle here. So the puzzle is that we say these things, Demis Hassabis himself says these things about the systems that he is working with. He says that we don't know what's going on. But in another, and I think quite obvious sense, we sort of basically know literally everything that it's possible to know about what's going on inside these systems. That's the most obvious sense of do we know what these systems are doing or not? Yes, we literally know everything about them, right? We know the function of every element in the system. We know to which inputs that function is sensitive. We know all of the training data, usually, sometimes, or if not, we know at least the sort of parameters of the training data if we've generated some training data that we're not quite sure about. And we know the nature of the training algorithms that we've employed, right? So we know sort of historical narrative as well as current mathematical structure of the system. And we know what design decisions we've employed, what tricks we've employed, right? Whether we've done some dropout, and so on. So, in one obvious sense, we literally know everything about these systems. And I can feel, the possibility of some pushback on that, and quite a lot of the talk is going to be reassuring you that you really do have something like complete knowledge of these systems, that there's an obvious and important sense in which they are perfectly transparent. So the puzzle is, given that these systems are massively transparent, what are we talking about, really, when we say that there's opacity involved, right? What is actually the problem? I mean, just another note on that, like, notice that these systems aren't indeterministic or anything, right? That might get us really worried. If you fire the same proximal inputs into these systems, right, unless you're then running training algorithms over them, you're going to get the same results every time, right? So that even if they're probabilistic, in the sense that they're working over probabilities, they're deterministic in the sense that for the same proximal input, they're always going to give you the same output. I take it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I just want you to contrast the position we're in vis-a-vis artificial deep neural networks with the position we're in with respect to natural neural networks. Right? And when you go and talk to cognitive neuroscientists, you don't find any of this sort of opacity pessimism going on. Right? They're all saying, wow, we know loads, we understand tons of the mechanism, right? This is all looking good, we're incredibly optimistic. Right? But at the same time, we know far less, far less about natural neural networks than we know about the ones that we've built, whose mathematical functions we can look at and inspect without any problem. So that's the puzzle. The puzzle is, what do we mean by opacity in the face of massive transparency? And I guess sometimes people just mean one of two things that I want to set aside. Right? Sometimes people mean that these are black boxes in the sense that, like, someone has sealed them up for their own purposes. Right? So they've sealed them up because they're worried about intellectual property, or they don't want you to know how decisions were made, or whatever it is. And I accept that that's a really interesting problem. Right? It's problematic in the sciences if we want to be able to collaborate and share information and so on. But it's not the kind of deep problem of opacity that people like Hassabis seem to be referring to. Right? After all, that's a problem that is shared by data sets themselves, or very simple widgets, right, that just happen to be patented or held in some kind of clever way so that other people and competitors can't get to know them. So there's an issue there, but it's not an issue of opacity in any interesting, philosophically interesting sense. So we can rule out, or just set aside, that kind of worry. But notice that lots of people who talk about the interesting and specific opacity of things like deep learning networks say things that are compatible with that sort of less interesting kind of opacity. So just to make an example, out of context and unfairly so, Eschenbach, 2021, says, what is the problem of deep neural networks? The problem is that observers can witness the inputs and outputs of these complex and nonlinear processes, but not the inner workings. And I mean, that's true of me, right? But if you're a designer of one of these systems, of course you can look at the inner workings, right? You can see every single node and every single function, inspect it as much as you wish, right? So we haven't quite clinched what the opacity is there, I don't think. The other thing that I want to set aside is just what I call lay opacity. So the opacity of the system relative to people like me, right? Just outsiders without enough of a mathematical background. So sometimes when people talk about opacity, they do just mean, like, people like you, Will, are just not going to get this, right? You just don't, you haven't done enough differential equations, you don't know what the sigmoid function is, and so on. Now, of course, that is a form of opacity, and it's interesting and important because it's one of the reasons why there might be a difficulty of trust. So the image up on your screen is the image of a nuclear power station. And a nuclear power station is something which is very complex, that most of the public, including me, are technically minded and knowledgeable enough to understand. Okay, and of course, you might think that there's a correlation between that and the worries around trust, right, that there are with nuclear power stations. But I take it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's meant to be an opacity problem which is different as between a nuclear power station, like the kind of opacity that a nuclear power station manifests, and the kind of opacity that a deep neural network manifests. But, and here's a quote even more unfairly taken out of context from Carlos Zednik, who hopefully will be with us for the Explainable AI Roundtable. And he says, look, what's the problem? What's the problem of opacity? It's that it's difficult to know why these systems do what they do or how they work. Well, like, okay, but it's difficult to know why a nuclear power station does what it does or how it works, but we don't think that there's the same kind of problem of opacity for a nuclear power station as for a deep neural network. So we've set aside two kinds of IP, intellectual property and interest of the public. Okay. Another thing that people talk about is just the complexity of these systems, right? So you heard that in a previous quote. There's an awful lot of nodes in a deep neural network. There's an awful lot of functions being carried out. There's an awful lot of inputs and outputs through the system. And sometimes this is sort of collared as being where the opacity stems from. But I don't think that's quite right either. Think back to the nuclear power station. One problem is that the public are just too dumb to understand them. Right? Another problem is just that they're massively complex, right? Internally, there are huge numbers of different kinds of systems all interacting with each other. There's huge numbers of software components, hardware components, and so on. And so there's a sense in which nuclear power stations are too complex for anyone to understand. Okay, but there's definitely a sense in which people don't think that their inner workings are opaque, and the regulators say that they would not accept a system which had any element of opacity in it. Okay, so the regulator thinks that it knows as a body, or has access to the knowledge of everything that's going on inside a nuclear power station. So what you might say, if you don't like the idea that there's complete knowledge, is just that these systems are fully inspectable. Okay? And in that sense, the nuclear power station is transparent, but also the deep neural network is transparent as well. So we haven't uncovered the specific problem. It's not that kind of complexity of just loads of parts. Is that not true?
No, it's not
Good.
true.
So it's not that kind of complexity, at least, that we can sort of finger as being the problem of opacity in deep neural networks. Wow, this is really impressively blue, this blue box that we're working in. Okay, so maybe at some point you'll glimmer a glimpse of an ant. And something that some people say, which I think is sort of more interesting and perhaps fairer than talking about how dumb the hoi polloi is, right? What David Hume would call the vulgar, right? What they know, is the thought that, look, you know, we as humans, right, our brains are only sort of designed for so much. You know, there's only so many dimensions that we can work with at any one time. And of course, you know, the point of these neural network systems is that they're supposed to be able to, you know, make use of sort of hyperdimensional space and so on. So maybe we just don't have the brains, you know, rather like some things an ant can do, there's lots of things an ant can't do. Ant can't do differential equations. We can't do the kinds of calculations that would give us the explanation of the inner workings of the deep neural network. Now, you know, maybe I've sort of haven't said that I'm going to set this aside, but I think that there's something really sort of weirdly pessimistic and odd about this thought. I mean, you can understand all of the mathematical functions within, I can, within a deep neural network. And, you know, when we think about what our brains are good for in general, I mean, they're good for understanding the first milliseconds of the Big Bang. They're good for understanding quantum theory, which is just massively divorced from anything that, you know, we've grown up being able to think with evolutionarily, for example. We can think about string theory, Right? We can build a Large Hadron Collider and think that we understand what's going on inside it. Right? And come on, we're awesome. Right? And the idea that suddenly we get to these relatively simple functions within a mathematical system whose mechanical underpinnings are basically irrelevant, and we can't understand what's going on, just seems odd. Right? Seems unfairly pessimistic. And I guess to come back to the point about complexity, you might think, look, okay, you can understand each of these functions, but one thing you're not getting as an individual is just like you just can't, these millions of nodes, they're all doing stuff. But remember the nuclear power station. Right? As a body, the Health and Safety Executive Nuclear Department thinks that it understands all our nuclear power stations, right? Even though they've got this dimension of like material construction, which is of massive importance. Right? It makes it much harder to understand. So as a group, right, as a group of designers, or if we really cared, put enough regulators in, surely if we had the deep learning equivalent of the nuclear health and safety executive, we could understand what these systems were doing. So I just don't really buy that the opacity here can be obviously pinned on our cognitive limitations. Right? The kind of transparency we care about is the kind of transparency that a system can have that's too complex for any one individual to understand. And the kind of machinery that we find when we look inside a deep neural network is not, can I say it's not rocket science? You know what I mean, right? It's not unintelligible. I mean, these are just nice functions. We can see what inputs they're sensitive to, and so on. So, oh look, that has come at this is the second pinnacle of the talk, which is when you see the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So my thought is, like, these ways of sort of explaining away the problem of opacity aren't working. And what we need to do is to reflect on Douglas Adams and remember that the crucial thing to work out is what your question really was. So famously, they employ this enormous, mega deep learning machine to work out what the meaning of life is, and it spits out the answer 42. And what they realize is they just hadn't adequately articulated what their question was. They didn't know what they were trying to explain. And I take it that what we need to do in order to understand where there is opacity is to understand what we were trying to explain, what the gap in our explanation is, given all of these explanations that we can present of the function of the system. And in a very helpful distinction made by an early cognitive scientist, David Marr, and rekindled really helpfully in this excellent paper, which I highly recommend everyone reads, by Carlos Zednik, who's going to hopefully be with us for the roundtable. We see that there's sort of quite useful ways, even in a relatively sort of quick and dirty way, of thinking about the different kinds of questions that we might want to ask. In other words, the different kinds of things we might want explanations for, the different things that there are, the different phenomena that are around that we might want to find out about. So Marr distinguished between the level of implementation, where we're interested in where things are going on, like for him, which neurons were carrying out or realizing perceptual functions. We can think of what he called the algorithmic level, where we're thinking of how stuff happens, so sort of, how the system mechanically realizes some computation, as it were, what the sort of machine code is. And then the level of computation, where we're doing something like asking questions about what the system is doing with capital letters, or why the system is doing what it is. So here's another quotation from Zednik. He says, even if we know the values of individual parameters, perhaps the problem is the fact that these values are often numerous and non-linearly coupled, and that means that we can't readily track the way individual inputs are transformed into specific outputs. Now, I've highlighted two phrases that I want to pick up on there. One is readily, Right? Now, no one said it was easy to work out what was going on in a nuclear power station, right? But that doesn't stop a nuclear power station being transparent. So if the problem is just that it's like a bit hard and you can't be bothered, right, that's not a special problem of opacity. That's just that you can't be bothered. Right? So I think we should sort of delete the readily bit there and say, look, maybe the problem is that we're finding it hard to track the way that individual inputs, or we can't see a way of tracking the way individual inputs are transformed into specific outputs. Now, there's an unfair reading of what we mean here where that seems completely false. Okay? Because if you take any specific output, any pattern of nodes in the output layer or vector, whatever, however you want to conceive of just a specific output, well, of course you can track all the way back to the individual inputs. And you can see exactly what functions were performed in order to get you to that specific output. So at the level of, where, if you're a hardware guy, or how, if you're interested in the algorithm, it seems like there's just no problem yet. We haven't identified the problem. We still haven't. And here's a quotation from Watson, this is in a paper that's being very, very mean about deep learning machines. But Watson says, one of the worries is supposed to be that it's difficult or impossible to understand the internal logic of individual predictions. Now, difficult, again, does that mean you can't be bothered? That's nothing to do with transparency and opacity in any interesting sense, at least philosophically. Let's delete that. Right, imagine that you can't understand the internal logic of individual predictions. Again, there's a sense in which that just seems obviously false. Right? Because if an individual prediction is just a pattern of activated nodes at the output layer, then of course you can see the internal logic that gets you there, right? Because you can just trace it back. And okay, it's massive and there's loads of functions, but that's like a nuclear power station, not like something especially magic and mysterious like the mystery black box that we're talking about. So it looks like if we're thinking about implementation and if we're thinking about algorithms, there's just nothing opaque in this deep sense with deep learning systems. So presumably then, if we're going to find any interesting opacity, it's at the level of computation. And why I've highlighted those last phrases, specific outputs, individual predictions, is because a lot depends on how you understand what those are. So as I've said, if you take any just token output, right, pattern of activation at the output layer, then you can provide a fully specific, complete description of the mathematical mechanisms which produce it, right? You just hold up the deep neural network. Ta-da! It's all completely transparent. Inspect it at your leisure. So the question is, what's missing from that? And what's missing from that is the realization that that output, if we think of it as a prediction, what we're doing is thinking of it as a representation. And of course, if there's any representation baked into a deep learning system, it's going to be that output representation, right? Because you just choose what you're looking for as an output, and you're getting the system to give it to you. So you can treat that output as a representation. But notice that as a representation, right, it's not just a single event of some nodes firing in an output layer. Right? A representation is something that requires there to be a pattern of firing. Right? It's very hard to know what representations are, especially when we get to artificial systems. But there's got to be some kind of pattern. A representation is a tokening of a kind, right? A kind, finding this high-level feature F, dogs or solubility or whatever it is. So the questions become precisely these questions that Zednik identified of how the system tracks a particular feature and why or when the system is tracking that feature. It looks like it's only when we get those questions and we're very specific that it's the representation or the output as representation that we're interested in that we start to find real problems of opacity. So what Zednik says is that one of the things that might give us sort of some hope here is that when we're asking those kinds of questions, we need to look outwards, right? What is a representation? It's meant to be some kind of interesting relationship between a high-level feature or a feature of the distal environment and the output itself. So we get this nice quote, which I can't see on my own screen, so I'm going to have to come around here, which is questions about why a system does what it does, a question about the behavior's appropriateness, which is linked to its representational status within a particular environment. So these questions call for an interpretation not just of the system, not of the system itself, like the insides of a nuclear power station, but in terms of recognizable features of the environment and how the system relates to them. So we can do everything. There's no opacity if we're just thinking about proximal inputs and patterns of node firing at the output, right, piece by piece. The problem is when we get to the feature level. And I suggest that really that's not a problem to do with deep learning networks at all. I've got to speed this up. The problem here is that we don't understand the problem space outside the deep neural network. Okay? If there's a problem, it's that we don't understand that space. So think about dogs. Right? We have no way of really understanding any interesting connections, any explanatory connections between dogs and colors or shapes, right? Low-level features. And we have even less of an idea of how, in any explanatory sense, we can link the property of being a dog to like patterns of pixel, right? The kinds of inputs that you're going to feed to a deep learning network. So I'm happy to talk about these heat map things. Very briefly, that doesn't help very much. Although it does help with some things, but it doesn't help us to understand what we were worried about not understanding. So here are the real problems. To sum up, deep neural networks don't have any representations baked in. And if we're finding it hard to find representations inside the system, it's partly because the problem, if you're thinking about spotting dogs, is an ill-posed problem in the mathematical sense. It's partly because a good generalized deep neural network is going to work, should work, over indefinite numbers of inputs. So it's not like you can imagine finding a pattern, right, between inputs and output in any simple sense. And I suggest if we're unsure how to provide some kind of interesting, abstract computational model of the system, it's probably because we just don't understand how things relate in the world outside the deep neural network anyway. And here's a lovely quote from another paper that you must read by Emily Sullivan, who I think is actually a colleague of Carlos. And she says, it's not the complexity or the black box nature of a model that limits how much understanding the model provides. Instead, it's a lack of scientific and empirical evidence supporting the link that connects a model to the target phenomenon that primarily prohibits understanding. So here's like the problem and dilemma for using neural networks for scientific discovery. Right? If it's not going to reveal the empirical structures that you're interested in. Right? It's going to make some interesting predictions about them, but you sort of already need to find out what's going on in the world anyway and to have a good empirical theory of it in order to understand what's going on inside your machine. Machines are going to be great for prediction, and of course, one useful thing is just to make sure that we've distinguished those two things, right? We know that we can have prediction without explanation and the other way around. Another important thing for scientific discovery is the form of input. So pixels of, pictures of dogs, that's a mess. There's no interesting connection between pixels and dogs. But other kinds of input that you might be putting in a scientific situation might have a lot more structure. They might be a lot more obviously and interestingly related in the problem space to the kinds of features that you're finding. Another interesting difference between dogs and scientific features is that the kinds of scientific features that we're spotting are probably themselves concepts which have intrinsic explanatory structure, right? They're concepts that form an aspect of a wider scientific theory and are thus more interestingly related to other things you might find in the problem space, unlike dogs, natural features. And of course, remember that we can always use these things for augmentation in some of the lovely ways people have been talking about. Thanks. That's it.